We have this thing in American politics where despite the fact that politicians make decisions that will affect the lives and possibly end the lives of thousands or tens of thousands of Americans in any number of different ways, they will then take a little bit of time to go off to dinners and things like that and joke about politics, about their personality flaws, in some cases their corrupt ways. And it can be funny, but it can also be revealing and a little bit depressing, and we're gonna hit all of those here. There was the Al Smith dinner, I believe this was last night, and Paul Ryan made a number of jokes. We're gonna play a few videos. First, here's one that will probably ring quite true to you.
Fact number 9, every morning, I wake up in my office and I scroll Twitter to see which tweets that I'll have to pretend that I did not see later on.
So that's a brief one for you. So that's funny. Like if Stephen Colbert had made that joke, I would think it was funny. It's a little bit less funny because he's making the joke because it's true, and he is providing a smokescreen for Donald Trump, a consequential smokescreen that has effect on policy. He does pretend not to see these things. He certainly does very little publicly to try to rein Trump in, even when he makes, when he says the worst things. Like Paul Ryan, even during the grab him by the pussy fiasco, had just the lightest bit of criticism for Donald Trump. So it's one thing for a comedian to joke about it. It's slightly different for the guy who did it yesterday and will do it tomorrow to joke about. I don't know.
Well, for me, I think that I think that's a lesson for journalists that are covering him now, that they should certainly point back to it, and that's been one of the takeaways. Because your point is, he is asked about these things. He does do that deflection all the time, and he really is the most appropriate counterbalance to Trump when it comes to a voice, given his role as the speaker. And the fact that he tends to not weigh in on some of the critical things is not just an abdication of responsibility, but now we know he's full of it.
Yeah.
Well, and he's not weighing in because he's got an agenda and he doesn't really care. He knows he can ride the personality, the cult of personality of Donald Trump, and as a result, see through his agenda. And he's already doing that. You saw him on the morning television shows this morning, flacking this. And again, riding the charm of, as Johnny says, making fun of himself and making fun of the process, and all of a sudden that softens the hard edges associated with these tax cuts for the rich. And he essentially rode on that, as I say, through this propaganda machine of the morning shows, and that's what he is really trying to do. So I agree. I don't find anything charming about all this. I find it softens what is a really toxic dialogue going on.
Yeah, and like you say, he has an agenda, and when it comes to the actual laws that are passed or not passed, he can and has provided a counterbalance in some cases to some of the worst instincts of Donald Trump. But that's not the only role he should hold. I mean, he can hide if he wants to. That's his right, I guess. But he's also one of the most powerful men in the country. If there's some sort of disaster, he's not that far off the presidency himself. And so when Donald Trump is doing things like talking about possibly clamping down the First Amendment rights of media outlets or accusing the FBI of colluding with Russia to attack him, like when he's doing those things, when he's attacking these core institutions of American democracy, well, like you're the sort of person that can speak up about that. If not Paul Ryan, who at this point?
I think a lot of these efforts, and I was watching him this morning thinking to myself, boy, this guy's really making, I think, a play for being president, should the nation survive to the point that he could actually make a run for it. And he does it by watering all of these issues down, by not commenting or by joking, saying, well, I didn't see that. He was offered offered a transcript of the president's remarks from the New York Times. He said, oh, you know what, I really don't read the New York Times. I mean, there was a sense of, really? You don't read, it's a major news outlet. You may consider it biased, but I think a transcript of the president, certainly there's no bias there. I guess what I'm trying to say is he's begun to soften himself, stay clear of the stuff that's really bad from Trump, right? And by doing that, I think create an image that is associated with a bigger political aspiration he has.
Well, look, he can try, but the damage that Trump is doing to the Republican brand, I mean, I know that seems comical at this point, but he is, and there is still something to be damaged there. That damage continues, and Paul Ryan may find out that when he runs for president, and he's been down this road before, he's just such a terrible candidate, but even if he wasn't, that the base he expects to be there is going to become a far worse thing after years of the undiluted effect of Donald Trump.
Well, just the one thing that I found really difficult about the thing last night too is I find Paul Ryan to be so unbearably smarmy that it's really hard for him to do comedy, I think, effectively because of just his tone and even the way that he just approaches everything. It almost sounds like not a joke at all, and it's just I don't know how somebody that smarmy could do comedy.
Yeah. Well, why don't we see just a little bit more? Next topic is going to be some of the tweets.
I personally have learned so much in Congress. For example, I learned that tweeting after midnight is a really bad idea. Whether you're President Trump or especially Anthony Weiner. Or Ted Cruz, for that matter.
You have to remind me. I do remember. What was it that Ted Cruz did recently?
No, I didn't get the Ted Cruz.
Oh,
his
Twitter account liked incest porn.
That's right. It was a like.
It was a like. Wow. But likes are public, so you can see it.
Yeah. See, now again, for the most part, like, look, Anthony Weiner, obviously, like, it's a little bit easier to joke since he's actually been punished, which is rare in Washington. The Ted Cruz thing is fun. But the Donald Trump thing, like, yes, we can all joke, haha, he tweets crazy stuff late in the night, but that stuff matters. That stuff could theoretically get us into a war. Maybe you should take it a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, and by the way, they did everything but circle a mob with torches on the Weiner thing, and yet we can now make a joke about it. Either you think it's a super serious thing involving a minor and a sexually explicit or certainly suggestive photograph that's sent to that minor. Either you think that's so important that you want to go on a jihad about it, which is what they did, and then you can't joke about it, or you don't think it's that important and you can joke about it. But you can't have it both ways. They really did. They drove that. And especially during the election, as you know, those references to Weiner and his and really who he was and his character flaws. And I guess what I'm saying is that joke, that reference really landed cold for me. I mean, it struck me. Remember the play-by-play guy the other night, Al Michaels, had to apologize for a Harvey Weinstein joke.
That's true.
And so, and yet you can get away with a joke about some guy who sent a sexually suggestive photograph to a minor. Sorry, don't buy it.
Yeah, and by the way, like, the other angle of that is if you're going to imply, like, look at what Anthony Weiner did. We can't have somebody with, you know, the weird perversions that he has in a high office, but Donald Trump's cool. Let's not worry about his history of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Again, we referenced this a little bit earlier, but Paul Ryan could have come out much more strongly against, like, let alone all of the women that came forward. I mean, there were any number of different times when people could have attacked Donald Trump or held him to account for what he's done, but especially the Access Hollywood video. You can't act as if what Anthony Weiner did just strikes to the core of your morals, but you're totally fine with Donald Trump being president.
If they were ringing a bell for every double standard here, there would be a guy behind them just ringing the bell constantly. It's absurd.
Shame. Anyway, let's go to the next video. I think about one more.
The truth is, the press absolutely misunderstands and never records the big accomplishments of the White House. Look at all the new jobs that the president has created, just among the White House staff. And when you read the papers tomorrow, everyone's going to report this thing differently. Breitbart's going to lead with, Ryan slams the president amongst liberal elites. New York Times is going to report, Ryan defends the president in a state Hillary won. And the president will tweet, 300,000 at Al Smith dinner cheer mention of my name.
Now, any part of that is, again, the sort of joke that a late night comic might make, but he's not a late night comic. He's a guy who understands that chaos in the White House has consequences when you don't staff dozens upon dozens of incredibly important government positions for months at a time. Even Homeland Security went for a long time without a director and all that. These are not just punchlines, these are consequential, and he could put pressure on Donald Trump to take it more seriously. Trump being willing to lie about basic facts that everybody understands, that has consequences. Maybe he could put pressure on Donald Trump to be a little bit more wedded to the truth.
Now I would say all right, but it's that kind of dinner, and those jokes are sort of accepted as part of that kind of that environment. Look, those jokes are written by joke writers who all, serve that speech up to him, and then he just delivers it. It was delivered well, but I'm just saying it's not as though he sits there and cleverly thinks of all these lines. So in that context, I mean, I'm going to give the guy a little a wider berth. But now to John's point, and it's sort of. Sorry for not having a bigger sense of humor about all of this, but we're on the brink of so many serious issues that it's very hard to look at this stuff and laugh. The gutting of the EPA, the brink of war with North Korea and beyond. I mean, the pulling out of the Iran Accord from a president who probably couldn't even tell you what's in the Iran Accord. I mean, there's. So the issues are so serious, and you continue with the lack of staffing and State Department of jobs and all the rest, and on and on and on and on. We don't quite have the sense of humor about all of this stuff that Ryan is hoping that we would have, or that certainly that we can provide on this panel today.
Yeah,
I agree.
It just has a little bit of the vibe of like, they had the people who played the violin as the Titanic was sinking. Like, yeah, you could have a stand-up comic instead of a band, but it's still kind of depressing. Anyway, yeah, I wish that he would take his position a little bit more seriously. Like, I would be much cooler and have a better sense of humor with him joking about these sorts of issues if he was aggressively out there day after day trying to protect what's left of American democracy and the function of the government. Something that he traditionally has not been particularly serious about.
And by the way, just a last thing, he could say, if he doesn't want to disagree with the president on everything, he could pick his battles. He could say, well, of course, I don't believe that journalists in this country should be jailed for, but I think that maybe the president meant some other things. You try to soften those edges on the president's comments, but go on record disagreeing with it. He doesn't even do that.
TYT membership gets you commercial-free Young Turks. Download it, stream it, podcast it. Get all the network shows and support independent media. TYTnetwork.com/join.